I'm going to talk about the business plan priorities. So as the trainers group, so our group is called the Multi-Agency Learning and Development Group, fondly called, of course, because the safeguarding partners love acronyms, the MALDAG. So we're called the MALDAG. And our work is governed, obviously, by the safeguarding partners. And the way that's done is through sort of the business plan and the business plan priorities. So I'm going to look at what they are. We also do other work that comes out of reviews and policy changes. So I'm going to look at some of that. I'm going to talk a little bit about national reviews, some things that are coming up that we will have sessions on later. And then I'm just going to mention the Safeguarding Children's Competency Framework update, because a lot of people do use that, but not so many people who are in the statutory agencies, because they have other frameworks. That's the reason why. Okay, so the business plan priorities. So these are across LLR, which is brilliant. At one point they weren't. There were some for Leicester and some for Leicestershire and Rutland, because there's two separate safeguarding partnerships. So one's for Leicester City, one's for Leicestershire and Rutland. And at one point we had all different kind of priorities, but now that's all together. So that's much easier, certainly for me and for people who work with children across LLR. And these are they. The first one is safeguarding babies. Second, child mental health and emotional well-being. Third, keeping adolescents safe, supporting safe adolescents. Fourth is safeguarding children from diverse backgrounds. And the fifth is effective safeguarding in independent and out of school settings. And I'm going to go through each one. And I don't think it's that surprising that safeguarding babies is a business plan priority. We know that they are some of the most vulnerable because of their dependency on others. And we have had several reviews locally that where babies have been harmed or killed or died. So it's way up there as part of our priorities. And one of the things that we're doing, Amy, yes, I'll provide the PowerPoint afterwards. Yes, definitely. One of the things that's happening across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland is ICON. Has everybody heard of ICON? Yeah, brilliant. So there's nods. So it's infant crying is normal and it will stop. Comfort methods can sometimes soothe the baby and the crying will stop. And I think this is the key thing. It's okay to walk away if you've checked the baby is safe and the crying is getting to you. So this whole idea that you can cope through crying, that you're not always going to be able to stop the crying of a baby. And actually, that doesn't mean you're a bad parent because babies naturally cry. So sort of reassuring parents that it's perhaps nothing that they're doing wrong. It's just that the baby's crying and they need to kind of take a breath and calm themselves. Never ever shake or hurt a baby. And that's the website there, which is a really good website. It also translates into different languages, so it can be used perhaps on an iPhone or an iPad or other phones or Android ones. Sorry, I shouldn't say that, but on mobile digital aids to share with parents if you want to. And part of what we know from the ICON message is that that there'll be 6 touch points, and women naturally are privy to those touch points because it's sort of in antenatal visits, it's after birth, and it's with health visitors, and it's at GP checks, but men aren't always there. And what we know is that 70% of head injuries are caused by men. So head injuries in babies are caused by men. And so we want to try to get this ICON message out to men and partners and other carers of babies that may not have been in some of those health situations for lots of different reasons, not necessarily because they don't care, but because they're at work, because it's not appropriate, they're not able to get there for whatever reason. But also if they are in the house, we're asking that people talk to men as well as the women about the care of the baby. So That's what the push is at the moment for Icon, and it's being launched publicly. So it's been launched to professionals, and then it's Icon Week, the 27th of September that week, and there's going to be a whole sort of launch to the public and some more radio messages. So there's already been some radio messages, but they're trying to get radio messages on local radio, some films that will be released, that sort of thing. So to try and get that message out there. So that's Icon. So if you know about Icon, I guess you know these films. I'll just put the links in there. But I Am Unshakable is a really good film, I think, to show to parents. It really says that you know, you can cope through the crying. And I do think it is that little bit of reassurance. I think when parents are, especially if it's their first baby, they feel like they should know what to do, and they feel like they're bad parents if they can't stop the baby crying. So I think it is a really quite an important message and simple message. And then there's Ellis's story there as well. If you've not watched that, you need to steel yourself to watch it. It is quite upsetting. It's a story of, it's not a story, it's a true account of where a baby has been shaken and harmed, and sort of the impact that has. And I think what's interesting about that, and what's been sort of I've been reminded of recently, is that not all babies that are shaken will die from their injuries. Some may live for a few years and have a limited life, but some may grow into adults. But the damage that's caused to their brain from being shaken goes with them into adulthood. And sometimes I think we forget that. So when we're working with adults who've got brain injury from whatever, but from being a shaken baby, that's never going to fully recover. So although they're getting all the help and support they might need, it still might mean that they don't function as they would do if they didn't have that brain injury. And I think sometimes in children's, definitely, can't speak for others, but we forget that you know, if parents have got an injury that impacts on how they behave and can function, we sometimes don't understand that, I think, especially if they're getting the help that they're getting. I think there's a lot of us that think, oh, well, they're children and they can recover. They've had all this support and they can recover. And yes, they can recover and they can learn to cope and manage, but not wholly. They'll still have that injury. So just something to think of. And I was reminded of that when we were asking the Violence Reduction Network if they were doing any work around shaking a baby. And because their premise is to reduce violence, and obviously shaking babies is violent, and it's a crime as well, if it leads to, well, it would lead to harm and GBH and or death. So and what she said was, so I was talking to Grace Strong, who's the VRN lead. I don't know what they're called, what her title is, but she's the lead, and she was saying they hadn't really thought about it, but what she had noticed, that in the criminal justice system were a lot of adults who had been shaken as babies and who had brain injury. And I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. So that's what reminded me. I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. Actually, I'd not really come at it from that sort of aspect necessarily before. I was simply thinking about babies and, you know, obviously not harming them. But we do want the Icon message to be delivered through safeguarding training. Just to mention that it's, you know, something that's being rolled out, and that there are resources available. And that sort of focus on men also feeds into the national review, The Myth of Invisible Men, which I'm guessing you've all heard of as well. But that, I mean, it didn't look at that many men, but it did look at perpetrators of non-accidental injury into under 1-year-olds. So it looked at basically that group of men who, if they didn't shake a baby, caused an injury in a different way. And what that report said was that we weren't including men. So this is another reason why there's that focus on men for the ICON message, and for us as practitioners. I think it'll and I think it will come into practice more as we move forward. But there is evidence that universal services such as midwifery and health visiting during the periods before and immediately after birth do not regularly, significantly and substantially involve fathers. This then appears to set a pattern in practice which is replicated throughout target and specialist services and into the family courts. So it's not just blaming health and all, midwives and all. It's saying actually they may start in that pattern, but actually nobody changes that as it goes through. So I think it's something, while we're delivering training and if we're delivering services as well, we really need to think about how we include men, engage with men, etc. And what it has led to as well is us changing our procedure. I've put the link to the procedure. These are Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland multi-agency procedures, so they apply to everybody working with children across LLR. And this bruising, marks or injury of concern in pre-mobile babies and non-independently mobile children is online. And what I'd say to people is, we talk about procedures a lot, but they are really good. Read them. They're actually really good. So I think this one, I know it's had a lot of input in terms of what words should we use, how should we phrase it, what should we do and say, but it's a really good procedure. It's really clear, and I know that now in a lot of areas where there is a bruise, they will automatically put that forward as a safeguarding referral. If a bruise goes into a GP, they will put that through as a safeguarding referral. So unless you've actually perhaps seen that bruise happen, so you've seen a toddler hit a child in the face with a baby in the face with a toy and bruises appear, then and we must be very skeptical and curious about bruises and marks, especially on non-mobile babies, because we know when we've had reviews in, bruises have quite often been not missed but haven't been attended to appropriately. We haven't placed as much concern on them as we should have. So that's been updated. And then it's sort of just back to this myth of invisible men. It was quite sort of damning. I think it's very critical of sort of workers across the board in sort of public services, saying fathers are both absent and enabled to be absent across the range of service provision through child in need, child protection and children in care services. There is insufficient evidence that this absence is being routinely tackled within the system. So it's sort of this systemic idea. And I do think that maybe we'll have to sort of evidence that we have tried to engage with the father or the person in the house. I mean, we know from audit that quite often when assessments are done, we don't know necessarily who's in the house and what their relationship is to the children and or the mother of the children. So, and we also don't necessarily know whether they are helping to care for the children either. So there's something about some routine questions that we're possibly not asking, we're not being professionally curious about. And I am generalizing, some practitioners are very good in some areas, there are systems that pick that up, in terms of signs of safety. So Emma's here now, signs of safety has been brought in. We're getting a better picture when we're talking to people, but of course there is also that thing that people will try and hide what's happening sometimes in their house as well. So you'd think the answer would be training, because that's what they normally say. Oh, we need to be trained on how to work with men. So I was actually quite pleased that that isn't the answer, because what they're saying is that you should know how to do it anyway. They're saying skills and knowledge held by safeguarding professionals who work with children and families can and should be used when working with men. Approaches to engagement, to interviewing and to listening should be the same for both women and men. Exploring their histories, where they draw support from, how they see their futures, again, This is common ground for those working in the field and applies to both men and women. The evidence from this review suggests that there is insufficient evidence that practice with men has these characteristics. So what they're saying is, you've got the skills, you've got the abilities, you're just not doing it. You're not doing it routinely, you're not trying to talk to men. And I think perhaps we'd acknowledge that if we have a good relationship with the primary carer, usually the mother, and that's a good, positive relationship, that perhaps we do focus on that, because that gives us comfort that the baby's being sustained and, you know, and thriving and all the things that we want to happen. So it's quite interesting, and I've spoken to people, you know, in different agencies that said, well, actually, yeah, perhaps would, you know, if I was getting kind of good responses from the mum, I might not try to work with the mum unless she brought him in, or with the dad, sorry, unless she brought him in. Jackie, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Liz. Oh, lose my voice. I was just going to comment that we rolled this training out to the care team at the end of last year and the beginning of this year, and we kind of had a message of ask twice, because we find that when we ask dads about the care of their children, they'll say, oh, I don't know, you know, ask mum. And sort of mum's the default, that go back to mum. And so the message that we were giving out in training is to say, oh yeah, no, we'll definitely ask mum, but actually we want to hear from you as well. So not taking that initial kind of, oh, you know, mum knows more than I do, or actually suggesting to them that their voice is important.
Oh yeah, it's kind of giving them that affirmation. Yeah, it's actually okay for you to have an opinion, isn't it? That instead of that deferral to me. I like that. That's really good. Yeah, I think actually that's something we could include in our training about. I'm going to say that. I'm going to steal that, Jackie. Thank you. And that's what this is for today. It's about sharing resources and about sharing, you know, how we talk about things. And oh yeah, that's really good. Thank you. So other issues that we've got around babies and that are coming out in our reviews is that they are totally dependent on their carers. Obviously, we know that. And there may be parental issues such as mental ill health, substance misuse, learning disability, or domestic violence. Where there are more than one of these present, there is a greater risk to the child. Now, I used to deliver training with a police officer who used to balk a little bit at what was then sort of trilogy of toxic tree, and then went to trilogy of risk. And what he used to say was, actually, if one of those is present, there could be a massive risk to the baby. We don't want to find one and then look for others and then dismiss it because we've only found the one, which I think is a really good point. But where there's more than one, it kind of accumulates a bit. So we do need to be aware of these issues, as you know. And then there was another report, which came out before the myths of invisible men. So I'm guessing that you've seen or heard of it. But this out of routine, a review of sudden unexpected death in infancy in families where children are considered at risk of significant harm. And I think my understanding is this is the first time where those families that we have issues about, that sudden infant death was linked with them more so. So children will die suddenly, but where we have other concerns, it happens more often. There's a greater incidence of it. So that suggests that where we have concerns, we should have concerns, and we should look to perhaps try and resolve some of those concerns, and that might actually may mean that the child doesn't die. So that was an interesting report, I think, in terms of how it gave us clear evidence for one of the first times. They're also quite easy to read, the reports. They're quite long, but they're quite easy to read. They do quite good summaries as well, so that's really helpful. So this is what we've got locally. So the concealed or denied pregnancy was a review that was sort of pre-COVID, which you probably know about because it was very public all over the papers, where a mum killed her baby immediately after the birth, but she'd concealed that pregnancy. And what we're saying is, if you know that pregnancies have been concealed in the past, we need to be concerned if we think that the mother is pregnant again. Now, there wasn't really anything that agencies could have done in terms of knowing that she was pregnant, because she did conceal it. And obviously, if people are concealing and denying pregnancy, there's a myriad of reasons for it, but it's a concern. It could be a risk to the baby. It quite likely could be a risk to the baby. So I've known people who've concealed pregnancies. I worked with someone who was 15 when she was pregnant, and she concealed that pregnancy because she wanted a long leather coat for her 16th birthday. So, and she knew her mum would go mad if she found out. So she concealed that pregnancy, got a long leather coat, and then told her mum, who did go mad, but equally was very supportive.
It was interesting in this one because she concealed the previous pregnancy.
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, very similar circumstances. That baby was born as well, but you know, survived.
That survived, didn't it? Yeah. So, but there was concerns around the immediate birth, around the time immediately after birth at that point. Yeah. So yeah. And you know, it's difficult for agencies, if people are hiding stuff, it's difficult for agencies to know. But where we know there has been some sort of concealment, especially previously, like Helen's saying, then we should look out for that and be concerned about that. I believe she had tried to kill the first child, but we don't actually know, because she was come upon.
Yes,
she was happened upon. So we don't really know. But
she was very ill after the birth of the first baby, and but nobody knew she was pregnant before that. So
no. Yeah. So very interesting. So we did change our procedure on concealment and denial of pregnancy. I don't think we changed it. Did we have one before? But we've got a procedure on concealment and denial of pregnancy. And it's just, if you think, I'm not sure, have a look, and it will help you to think about the steps you should take. We also have a 7-minute briefing on concealed and denied pregnancy. So what do people think about 7-minute briefings? We've got quite a few that are dotted through this presentation. What do people think? If we were face to face, I'd give you a hard copy. I'd kill a tree for you, but we're not. So you'll have to print it off yourself. Jackie.
Yeah, no, I love them, and we've got something at the hospice that's called 10 at 10, and it's 10 minutes at 10 o'clock. When it's quieter and drugs rounds have been done and everything, where you can use a 7-minute briefing to actually do your 10 at 10 with staff.
Brilliant. Yeah, brilliant. I really like that. And that's what other people have said, you know, over the course of these sessions that I've delivered. They said they really like them. They spark the conversation. Emma's saying she likes the 7-minute briefings a lot. People talk about perhaps situations that have happened within their agency, or what's relevant to them about it, or talked about if it's a 7-minute briefing of a review or a case, you know, a situation, how you know what happened. And so yeah, people really like them. Short, easily accessible things are always a bonus. Yeah, I think so. My concern about them initially was that they might take over, you know, from training, learning about stuff. You know, you've had a 7-minute briefing, you should know it now, but they haven't been used like that. So I'm really happy they've been used as a tool to engage with people. Yeah, Helen.
Yeah, I actually like putting them together, you know, because sometimes it can be quite a challenge distilling things into a 7-minute briefing when you've got a 30 or 40 page report. You know, it's quite a challenge, and some have a lot of recommendations. But I think what we're also trying to do increasingly is not just aim these 7-minute briefings at team managers and frontline practitioners, but also are asking questions of senior management to think about the service that they are delivering, because as we are finding, some of the issues are more that they're systemic.
Yeah,
it's not just about frontline practice, it's about the way that a service is funded, the way a service is changed, or the way a service is delivered, you know. So I think that's you know, and as we know, we're in an ever-changing world of cuts and you know, staffing issues and you know, all sorts of things really that that is more systemic. So we're, you know, asking people in a management capacity and a more strategic capacity to say, actually, this is becoming an issue now, particularly when we're seeing things, you know, thematically, we're seeing things that are coming up time and time again. So yeah,
and I think that's really nice to hear, isn't it, that actually the partnerships are looking broadly at, so what does that mean for agencies, and why is that happening, especially if it happens on more than one occasion in a similar way, which is what we have got in the next bullet point. So death soon after birth following drug and alcohol abuse and chaotic lifestyle. So there are cases locally and that where this has happened, where children have died, babies have died immediately after birth or very, very soon after birth. And it's linked to the chaotic lifestyle of the mother, where drug and alcohol abuse are a feature, chaotic lifestyle, homelessness, sex working, missing health appointments, and things like that. And so we have got a learning event on the 14th of September, where one of the reviewers, so one of the people who's looked at one of the cases in particular, will talk about how we can learn from that. And I think that'll be quite a good event. Well, I hope so. Should be. But that's made us think more broadly about sort of services that are delivered and how they're delivered. In fact, the one of the cases is quite a good, shows very, very good multi-agency working. It shows that people were concerned, they were keeping track of what was happening, they were doing joint visits, and in fact they'd gone out on the day to do a joint visit and found the mother having given birth, and I believe the baby was already dead, but the mother was still alive, but unfortunately died later. So terribly, terribly tragic, but actually services had worked really, really well. And I think sometimes we need to say it did happen and it was terrible, but it was picked up really quickly because people were working really hard and working together as well and sharing those concerns. But what we have done in sort of light of that, so we'd already reviewed our pre and post birth planning procedure, but we're looking at it again because some of these cases are quite recent, so we're just checking that we've covered everything, and we're sort of looking at the post-birth planning. So pre-birth planning has improved dramatically over the past few years, I would say, hence why we got some good multi-agency working on that particular situation. But now we're thinking, well, so where will the mum go immediately, the mum and baby go immediately after birth? What will happen? And are we so good at planning that? What about hospital discharge? You know, have we got the right information in place when people are released from hospital with their babies? So we're looking at that more closely. And there is a 7-minute briefing that I think's almost complete, looking at this particular chaotic lifestyle of mother type situation. Okay, you might know more about that than me, Helen, but I think that's just being kind of circulated, ready for sign off. So interesting things to think about, and it is where sort of children's and adults kind of cross over in some ways, but not in others, because some of the women, although they have chaotic lifestyles, they don't have care and support needs necessarily, so they wouldn't be offered any support from children's adult social care, but there are other services who could offer support, such as Turning Point, the domestic abuse services that we have, Living Without Abuse, Women's Aid, other ones. I don't want to miss any out, but you know, there's other agencies that can support women in these situations. Okay, so that's babies. We've now got child mental health and emotional well-being, and in terms of training, it's not saying, oh, you need to train on this. So with the babies one, you know, there's clear messages we want to get in there. You've got to work with men, you've got to include the icon message. But in terms of mental health and emotional well-being, what the priority says is that these are some of the issues that we need to work on. So joint working where children in need of safeguarding have been referred to mental health services. So what has happened historically is that when people make, say, their referral to CAMHS, this young person has some mental health difficulties, has some issues. I've referred them to CAMHS. It's almost like we're sort of like, oh, I've done my bit, they've got their referral, and now I'm not going to work with them anymore. Clearly that can't happen. If you're working with a child, you keep working with them, whether they've got a referral to another service or not. You then work with that other service to see what it is that you do in terms of safeguarding and supporting the child and young person. So we need to do more on that. We know that young people report mental health support needs not always being well understood by schools. So there's something around schools. What support can we give to schools? Are schools getting enough support? Through doing these sessions, so I know there were some specific posts in Early Help, IAPT posts, where they were trained for lower level mental health needs to offer some cognitive behavioural therapy, and they'd get support as well with that. But I've been told, and I need to follow it up, that those in Leicestershire don't actually sit in that role anymore, or they're not doing that role. So I need to find out. They've kind of been subsumed into a broader service. So I need to actually find out if that's true or not, because it's still being kind of talked about as part of the pathway. So if it isn't there, we need to look at what's happening with that. There's also an issue about CAMHS waiting lists. There was an issue before COVID. CAMHS did a lot to bring that waiting list down. I think it got it down to 12 weeks, which is still 3 months, but you know, it was better than it was. And they've done that by this pathway, by saying actually there's other services available before you get to the point where you need CAMHS. CAMHS is a specialist service, it's high level, only very few children and young people will need that service. Most can be dealt with in a different way through using the early help workers, through I think there's crisis cafes as well that have been set up, although somebody said that they're not all for children, some are 18 plus only. Again, I need to look at that. But there's websites, there's Relate, Do Work, there's work being done with schools about resilience in schools. So we got to quite a good point just before COVID, and then as we know, COVID's sort of aggravated everything in the worst possible way. So we have a lot more prevalence of mental health, and that's impacted. We've also got a little bit of a problem with recruitment in terms of some of those mental health services. So we need to check that that's a good enough service, that there's enough being done within that arena to support these children and young people. So that's what that ongoing work on design of services and pathways that will link to safeguarding is about, is for. And I think there's always this sort of anxiety as well from workers thinking, oh, that person's got mental health problems, therefore I can't help them. They've got to have a specialist worker. So it's about perhaps building confidence in the workforce as well, because as we know, just talking about a mental health problem can make a big difference to people. But it's that degree of what is that mental health issue, how serious is it, how much support do they need some sort of clinical input, what is the level of the issue for the young person. We do have local reviews, so we have again, this one was pre-COVID, the suicide attempt through taking prescription drugs. And then we've got another where there was a suicide of a teenager in a specialist facility, where there's been concerns about how they were moved around the system. So they were in care for a while as well. What decisions were made at what point, why? But, you know, obviously the impact as well of these suicides or people trying to take their own life, the impact through the family and the community is quite massive. So and workers, obviously workers as well. So their current reviews, that I think the top ones perhaps nearing publication, or I think it will just be an anonymous publication. I don't know about the other one, what stage it's at. Okay, so what we've done, what the safeguarding partners have done, is they've reviewed and updated the self-harm and suicidal behaviour procedure. And this, I think, is a good procedure. So it has a flowchart. We love a flowchart. It's really accessible, and within it is this other document, which is Leicestershire and Rutland practice guidance, supporting children and young people who self-harm and or who have suicidal thoughts. And there's lots and lots of information in there about tools you can use, how you can speak to children and young people that you've got concerns about, agencies that you can refer to. So there's lots and lots of information in that procedure, and then in the guidance as well, really trying to build a little bit of confidence in people, in frontline workers as well, because if you do read that, you'll know more clearly when you should perhaps refer on. But also there's helplines, there's all sorts of helplines that are there that people aren't using to the best of their ability. Helen.
It was a question really for Jackie, and maybe, I don't know, how supportive are our CAMs involved with young people with, you know, life limiting conditions, and how they might, you know, understandably there's an added dimension of impact on mental health, you know. And I wondered how supportive and how links were with CAMs really.
So I think it's fair to say that it's a challenge, and it's not so much, we find that the children themselves, children and young people themselves, there is support around for them. It's siblings, so it's the siblings of those children, and it can be very difficult to get CAMs to take them on because they don't meet the threshold. So, you know, we get it coming back to us all the time that the threshold hasn't been met for a CAMS referral. And it seems that they almost have to make an attempt on their lives first before they'll meet the threshold for CAMS. But on a positive note, we recently had a complex family admitted. There was a young girl who was 17 admitted for end of life care, and her twin was also resident. and they were also looked after children. And the psychologist from CAMS, who had been the young girl's psychologist, had started working with the twin as well, and was actually very supportive whilst they were resident in the hospice.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting when you've got that where there is sort of coexisting conditions, for want of a better word, but where there's I'm just thinking, and Amy might have a thought about this as well, is where you have a young person with a disability, with a learning disability, or you know that sometimes they refer it to that sort of diagnostic overshadowing, you know, where things are not picked up, you know, and the impact of that. It's almost like saying, well, it's like with older people, well, older people can't get, you know, they don't get depressed or sort of thing, you know.
And I think the other thing that we come across as well is it kind of been seen to be normal and appropriate for our children and their siblings to feel depressed because it's crap, isn't it? You know, they've been given a life-limiting condition. So it's almost that is used as another excuse. So they don't want to pathologise the mental illness because it's actually an appropriate reaction to what's happening, is a message that sometimes is given.
yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it, to think about yeah, how the thresholds work almost, because you were saying then that, you know, they've almost got to make that attempt to access services, and I think actually, so on the plus side, I think if people go into A&E, a young person with that sort of attempt or serious self-harm, there's quite a good response given at A&E now. There's a specialist team, so you know, it's almost like we're finding our way through how's the best way to work with different situations and different people. And on our one of these events, Women's Aid said that they'd actually employed a mental health worker in their own service to work with children in schools. You know, so where schools, yeah, so because I'm not saying everybody should do that, but I'm saying, but because they couldn't readily access one, they'd actually got to the point where they thought, actually, we need to do something ourselves. And so that's what they'd done. And then in the last one, Turning Point said that they use Stop, Breathe, Think, which I'd not heard of before, but they offer free counselling for a short period of time as well. So it's good to know about these resources. Sorry, I keep going hot and cold. And I think it is about pulling them into a pathway or something that we easily understand where we access what and at what point and how we access those services. Because then I think if we think they do meet the threshold, that's when we should be kicking and screaming if we possibly can, isn't it, to try and get the right service provided for the children and young people. But it's,
and I think,
carry on, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and it's also an awareness that, you know, especially I think children will behave in different ways, that so it's not, you know, as adults, if we're depressed, you've kind of got a picture in your head of what someone might look like, but for a child they may act out. And you know, Sharon's been involved recently in a couple of sibling weekends where we invite the siblings to come and stay, and you know, within those weekends you see the siblings of kids that we've got in our books acting out in different ways, but often that is indicative of their mood and how they're feeling, but they're not necessarily crying.
No. People who know me know that my background's in children's homes, and the first children's home I worked in was for children with disabilities, physical and learning disabilities. And one of the workers in there had been a sibling of a child who had a disability, and which was life limiting as well. And he said he'd come into the work actually not only to help the people with the disability, but also the siblings. He was very interested in this because he felt like he was just kind of not considered at all. You know, he wasn't considered how it might impact on him, and what it meant for him that he always came second. And you know, that's sometimes how he felt, and he knows that's not a nice way to feel when you know. So you know, all those things, all those how you feel about, yeah, so they can manifest in lots of ways, can't they? And in lots of can create sort of mental health issues, I'm sure. And I mean, he spoke about that quite openly. So, but he was an adult, so he'd got to that point, you know. So yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you. So I think we can see that we do need to do some work locally. There's a national sort of issue around mental health, as we know, in children and young people, but we are looking at that locally. It is one of our priorities. And then the next priority is keeping adolescents safe, supporting adolescents. So I've put the assessment of risk outside the home definition that's in working together to safeguard children, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So this is this sort of newer idea about safeguarding, about contextual safeguarding, which we can't call it contextual safeguarding because contextual safeguarding is an approach to working with risks outside the home. But if you want to know more about that, this is a really good website at the bottom. That TED talk is Carleen Furman, who I sort of hero worship slightly, but she's really the woman who coined the phrase contextual safeguarding. She was working with gangs in London, in children, doing some research with children in gangs in London. And I saw her speak, and she was saying that she'd come across a boy who had to rape a girl to be in a gang. He didn't want to rape that girl, but if he didn't rape the girl, he wouldn't be in the gang, and therefore he would be at greater risk. If he didn't rape the girl, somebody else would rape the girl. So the girl kind of was in a terrible situation anyway. And if he didn't rape the girl, he might be raped as well. So it's this kind of whole scenario of what does he do? So he rapes the girl, he then becomes an offender. So he's committed a crime, but he's also been exploited, and he's been in that difficult situation. So she started to look at when people are victims, but they're also perpetrators. And that's when she started to look at this and where the pressure came from to do some of these things. And she heavily criticises the child protection system, saying that it's set up really to save children from their families. So that when we see something that goes wrong, we say, oh, what are the mum or the dad doing over here? And we put in parenting programs and things like that to fix them. And that some of these harms, sometimes there are issues with the families, but sometimes actually fixing the family won't make any difference to this situation anyway. The review report on one of the young men who was killed, I can't remember his name, I'm sorry, I've got brain fog this morning, but he was stabbed. He was pulled off a motorbike, a motor scooter, and stabbed to death. And he'd been moved because of his concerns of him being in gangs. But his mum never ever believed he was in gangs. Never. She thought he was a lovely boy. He was always lovely to her. He'd shielded her from what he was doing. He'd always been lovely at home. So she never ever believed, because he didn't present like that at home. So she was even more shocked by what had happened. Although she knew there was some issues and things going on, she didn't believe that he was in gangs. But we're doing a lot locally around this particular area. So we've got our multi-agency child exploitation hub, which includes staff from the local authority, health and police working in one team. And I mean, that's been going for quite a long time. So sometimes we kind of overlook it a bit as it working in this arena. And what they did, that originally was a CSE hub, because we were originally looking at child sexual exploitation. We then thought, actually, there's more to this. And we got a few county lines cases, and we got children missing, and they weren't all involved in CSE. Some were involved in other activities, exploited for other activities. So that's why it's now a multi-agency child exploitation hub. It's looking across those, and they're quite interlinked, much more interlinked than perhaps we originally thought, because quite often they're big organised networks that are working across our area with people in different tiers until you get to the kids who are almost disposable in the sort of network, and they don't know anything about people higher up. Perhaps so if they are sort of do get nicked, they can't really do anything, and they can just move on to the next young person to pick up. So these are other things that we've got going on locally in terms of harm outside the home. So we've got quite an active violence reduction network, and I actually didn't know till recently, even though I've done quite a lot of work with the violence reduction network, that we're one of 20 areas, or is it 10? But anyway, we've got the violence reduction network because there's concerns about our violent crime. That's why we have. We're funded for a violence reduction network. But they're looking at different areas. So they're now focusing on the impact of parental imprisonment on prisoners, children. The impact on parental imprisonment on prisoners' children. So we know, for example, and I'm plucking this statistic out of the air, and I really, really hope I've got it right, but boys where their fathers are in prison or a parent is in prison, 65% of those boys will then go on to be in prison. So if we know that, we can perhaps do something to prevent that if we put in the right help earlier on. So there's a lot of work being done in that area. So they've had the trauma-informed programme, so I don't know if any of you were able to access that, but 3 tiers of trauma-informed training delivered by Barnardo's. My understanding is that Barnardo's have been funded for another 3 years. It might be 2. I'm not very good on actually the sort of specifics, but they've definitely been funded for a period of time to look at how they build on that trauma-informed training. I think they're looking at perhaps having trauma-informed sort of networks, perhaps pulling together some of the work, because there's been lots of work going on in different areas, so perhaps pulling some of that together. So schools have done a lot of work, for example, about trauma-informed practice. It's been done within local authority agencies, so perhaps pulling some of that together so that we're all kind of saying the same thing, which we probably are anyway. Yeah, so Emma's saying she did the trauma-informed training and she thought it was really good. I also did it and thought it was really good. So and the last one was about trauma-informed organisations and really thinking about what it's like as somebody who's using that service. How does it feel to them? What are the things that we can change to make it more trauma-informed? And I always think back again to when I was in children's residential, when we'd been trying to get this young lad into school for a long, long time. We had a school on site, and we'd work that morning, all the night before. Oh, come on, let's get you to school tomorrow. We'd put loads of effort in. We went to the door, knocked on the door. The teacher opened the door. What did that teacher say? He said, "You're too early. You're too early." How trauma-informed is that? That is not trauma-informed. So, and if he'd have said, "Oh, brilliant to see you here," and welcomed him in, he'd have probably stayed at school. But anyway, obviously he didn't go in when he was told he was too early. But so little things in how we work can make a big difference. So there's work being done in the East Midlands. So I don't know, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, I think Northamptonshire and Leicestershire and Rutland have all been working together to look at and been part of a project that looked at how we support young people better. And as a part of this was a project called the Three Girls, and these girls were at high risk. They were missing a lot. They're involved in they were being exploited sexually, and they were difficult to engage. These are difficult to engage. So they worked with these girls to see how they could be engaged better. And basically sort of some of the kind of principles were very trauma informed. So what they were saying was, come out and see us in our space. So don't invite us into a meeting at a place at 9 a.m. in the morning when we've perhaps been missing all night and we are quite traumatized. Come into our space, come and see us. So that's one of the things they said. And they also said, don't just talk to us about risk and harm all the time. Talk to us like we're people. Talk to us about things we like. Get to know us. So that whole relationship building thing, then we'll tell you in the conversation. If you come and say, what risks have you been, up to, they're not going to respond to that. So they're saying, build that, take that time to build that relationship. What they did get very positive outcomes. Those girls still do go missing, but their risk is much lower. So it's not low risk, it's medium risk. But these were girls that are entrenched in being exploited. They were being exploited in it. They were sort of entrenched in it. So it's really good movement to get to that sort of medium risk. But what they also realised as well from this project was that took a lot of resource. So now they're thinking of different ways of working. And what they've done in Leicestershire is that they've got additional workers in their first response team now. So they're looking at those low-level cases. So those cases where we just think there's something going on. We've got a few concerns. They want to work with those before they escalate. So it's that early intervention, that early help that we know is a better way of working. So not being reactive, but being proactive. And they've also got domestic abuse workers, specialist domestic abuse workers in first response as well, to try to look at that as well in a similar way. So I think it builds on that whole idea of early help and the importance of early help and how it is part of the bigger safeguarding network. It's not something separate. So it's not children's social care and then everybody else. That everybody else helps children's social care so that they don't get people being escalated up in there, so that we can work with people earlier. Working in a trauma-informed way, which we know is the way we should be working. And there's, like I said, there's a lot of kind of training and learning around that already. And then work on harmful sexual behaviour, which includes child-on-child sexual abuse and/or violence. So there's quite a lot of work being done across the local authorities, and now with health as well, that's just been picked up as well, about how we manage this. And Leicestershire Learning and Development Department have actually are advertising some training, which is you will have to pay a nominal amount for that training, but they've put together some tiered training to support people working on with harmful sexual behaviour. I also had to change this slide because I put peer on peer, and actually we should say child on child, because peer on peer would assume a 12-year-old to a 12-year-old, where it might be a 12-year-old to a 4-year-old. So that's why we should say child on child. Okay, thank you, Helen. Yeah, I'll perhaps see you later. So work going on around that. I'll come on to some more about that later as well. Okay, so nationally, and I didn't know about this until I did one of these sessions, which I think is quite bad actually, that I should have known about it, but there is a serious violence duty draft guidance for responsible authorities. So following the consultation in July 2019, the government announced that it would bring forward legislation introducing a new serious violence duty. The duty on sorry, that was sorry, being attacked by, that was a wasp, just so that you know, it was something very, very dangerous and not just a fly. Sorry. Oh, that was quite shocking. Right, so a new serious violence duty on public bodies which will ensure relevant services will work together to share data and knowledge and allow them to target their interventions to prevent serious violence altogether. And I feel like this is a bit of a two-pronged attack. So we've got something going on in children's social care and in terms of reviewing that, and I'll come on to that. But we've also got this sort of serious crime element, this serious violence element, which does get a lot of money put its way. So that's what we should kind of think about, is saying actually we need to work together to look at what violence we've got in our area and to help prevent it. So in addition to tough law enforcement, we need to understand and address the factors that cause someone to commit violent crime in the first place. So again, this early intervention. The duty aims to ensure that agencies are focused on their activity to reduce serious violence, whilst also providing sufficient flexibility so that the relevant organisations will engage and work together in the most effective partnership for any given area. So this is in the draft guidance, which obviously has to be agreed. It's been consulted on, and I think it's being looked at now. And this is the duty. It covers out the PCSC is the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, and it requires specified authorities to work together. Again, this working together. So this notion that the police deal with crime and serious violence is again moving away. So police have now got to be more involved in safeguarding and thinking that way, but also we've got to think about, why will people end up committing crimes? I mean, I think as social workers would, well, people who are social workers would think like that anyway, perhaps, that, you know, there's a reason why people perhaps causes a crime. I hope they would anyway. But, you know, it's this broader idea of why people commit crime and to try and stop it, to try to reduce it. And it should be done through a public health approach. And I thought that's a really good idea. And then I thought, I'm not really sure I know what a public health response is. Or approach. So this is a public health approach taken from the World Health Organization, focused on a defined population with and for communities, not constrained by organizational or professional boundaries, focused on generating long-term as well as short-term solutions. Those two really make me feel uneasy. Based on data and intelligence to identify the burden of on the population, including any inequalities. Good. Based on data evidence, rooted in evidence of effectiveness to tackle the problem. Brilliant. So we look at something, we do something, we see how good what we've done works, we see the impact of what we've done. My concern is not constrained by organisation or professional boundaries, focused on generating long-term as well as short-term solutions. We don't run our services like that. We commission services for 2 or 3 years. They get the commission, they move into position, they work well or not well, and then the final year is looking at being recommissioned. So that's not long term. That's not a long term solution. And also it's totally governed by what it says in that commission service. So actually, I'm not going to do that bit of work because that's not what I'm being employed to do. And you can't blame people for doing that because we've set it up like that. So we've set it up. So this is my bit. I'm going to do this bit. That's partly why I think when we know it's a mental health issue, we hand it over to CAMHS and think, haha, I've done my bit. CAMHS can do that. We don't see it holistically because we're not allowed to because of how our services are set up. That's me being a bit sort of, glass half empty about this. I do think it's a good idea, but I do think there's lots of sort of structural, systemic issues that will mean it will be very difficult to achieve. This is who must comply. So these are all the people that are sort of involved in the safeguarding partnerships and other boards and strategic bodies locally, except, and you may not say it, but schools are missing. So schools aren't on that list. Now within the duty, this duty that's been gone out of consultation, there is a big paragraph on, in fact, the section on what schools should do, and actually they're vital. They're absolutely vital to this. So why they're not in the list, I'm not sure, and I'm hoping that through the consultation somebody will say, well, education is not in the list, because it would take one word, it would just take education. So I think that might change. I hope that changes, because they clearly have a big role in the duty. So that's coming. I'm just going to whiz through the other two business plan priorities, because I don't have any other slides other than these two, because the safeguarding children from diverse backgrounds, we're currently looking at different ethnicities and culture. So we've taken some diversity, and that is ethnicity and culture. We've done an audit and collected data, because what we don't know is where there is a diversity, is the impact different from our services? We don't know, because we don't gather that data. So they're looking in a different way of gathering data this way to see what the impact is on access to services and impact for children and families. They'll then do an action plan, and I believe from that action plan there'll probably be some training or some gaps or some areas where we need to do some work. When they've looked at ethnicity and culture, and believe me, it probably took about 4 meetings to decide on that terminology in itself. This isn't going to be quick, that's what I'm telling you. They will look at different areas they'll focus on a different diversity. Now, when that comes to disability, I think there'll be a massive action plan from that, and I think it is to do with access to services and how that and the impact on them. So like we've already talked about how mental health might be not dismissed, but overshadowed, I think was the term that Helen used, by perhaps a diagnosis or something. Jackie, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Liz. I was just going to say, I don't know how many times I've spouted forth about it's all very well the voice of the child and all the things, and I don't get me wrong, it was brilliant, you know, the videos that were done around the voice of the child, but none of those children had a disability. None of those children were non-verbal. And so, you know, when we're looking at the voice of children with disabilities, we need to do way more.
It's interesting because we did Helen and I actually, and it was before COVID, we did a session on children with disabilities, and we had children who they were young people actually who had disability, who came and spoke to the conference. I mean, they were brilliant, but what was interesting was, I'm not sure if it was at the break or at the end, but people came to me and said, oh, can you tell them they did really well? I was like, they're here, you tell them they did really well, you know, that's you know, why don't you? And I must admit, I was quite shocked by that, and it did make me appreciate that perhaps some people's are overlooked just by the very that we find it difficult to talk to them, you know. So yeah, and that we need to change that. We really do need to change that. I agree. And my mum as well was very poorly. She had motor neurone disease, and people again would talk to me, or my dad wouldn't talk to her, you know, just because she was in a wheelchair. I mean, it's ridiculous. So yeah, so it was highlighted again to me. I just think, yeah, that's yeah, I agree with you. And I think I wonder if we've avoided a disability to start off with to kind of give us a basis. I don't know, because I think ethnicity is also a bit of a hot potato, but yeah, really interesting. But I think, you know, the transition bit as well, and all sorts of things where we're not working very well together either as well, I think for children with disability will hopefully come out of that. I mean, I hope it does, you know, I hope it's shown that that's an issue. So there's work to come from that. Like I said, I don't think it's a fast moving beast. I think it's sort of, you know, it's like trying to turn the Titanic, really, that one. effective safeguarding. Oh, just to say something else about that as well. So I went to the World Social Work Day conference, which was at De Montfort Uni. We supported it and we helped to run that, and it was transcending others, something othering, which I thought, oh God, that's such a social work title. What a load of, social work claptrap. But when I got there, it was really interesting. It's really made me think about diversity. The keynote speaker was Gurnham Singh, and he's a Sikh and he's from Bradford. And he says that, so when he introduces himself, he said, yeah, hello, I'm Gurnham Singh and I'm from Bradford. And then he says, people say, no, where are you really from? And it's that whole thing. And I hadn't thought about it before, how it makes you different. So you're not from Bradford originally or historically. So your hereditary isn't from there. So where are you really from? And it puts you in a different group. And I've noticed since I've been watching the news and stuff, since how we do that, how we put people in different groups. And I mean, I've been aware of it, but it's particularly with sort of, migrants crossing the channel and that sort of thing, different groups of people, and then how we see those groups of people. And he also did, and I'll come to you, Jackie, but what he also did was he spoke to a white person and said, oh, what's your culture? And she was like, oh, I've never been asked that question before. But of course, everybody has culture. So, it's just really made me think. So I think there's actually quite a lot of work to do around that sort of topic anyway. Sorry, Jackie, I'll come to you now.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the underlying message when you say to someone, where are you really from, is you don't belong here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you are different from, you are not part of this group here. You are different, you are other. Yeah.
And then, of course, that's that sense of identity, and you can see why people feel that they don't belong anywhere, because originally they might, their grandparents might have lived in Jamaica, but actually they don't feel like they're Jamaican.
No. Yeah.
I've put a clip in the chat of a brilliant, only short, it's a really short YouTube. I think it was done in New Zealand originally, but it's about the rights of the disabled young people, and it's absolutely fantastic. Sharon and I use it all the time in training, just to get people to think differently.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you for that. Thank you. I'll send it out with the PowerPoint so that people, just in case they can't access it easily here. Brilliant. And then the bottom point, effective safeguarding in independent and out of school settings. This really is to try and broaden the reach to who we reach in terms of our safeguarding messages. And this has been a problem for us in training for quite a while. We know that we've got quite a good contact list, but it's quite limited. We're not hitting a broad range of people. So it's how we build our contacts, to people like sports clubs in schools or in communities, how we reach more, just more different small, perhaps, charities or groups, to make sure that they've got the right sort of safeguarding processes and recruitment and that sort of thing. So for us in training, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to extend that, and we have been trying to do that for a while, a little bit unsuccessfully, I think, because there's a bit of a fallout between the local authorities and Voluntary Action Leicestershire, who do hold a big database on all the agencies, but we're not privy to that, unfortunately. But we're slowly but surely, by stealth, we're trying to pick up more people, so that's really good. Okay, I've been rambling on now for a while. It's roughly 10 to 11. Should we have a break and come back about 11:05? Is that enough time for everybody? We'll have a quick break. Lovely. I'll see you shortly. Oh, thumbs up. I'll just wait till actually 5 past because I'm so. Yeah, I like my numbers rounded, my time numbers. I did say 5 past as well.
Liz, I don't know, did I give you the date of the next Rainbows training? And did
Yeah, it's the 8th, isn't it?
Yeah, are you able?
Yeah, have we not heard from the police, have we, or anything?
No, I can.
And she was leaving, wasn't she?
And well, she was going to be joining the prevent team,
That's right, yeah.
so she might come and do the prevent training.
Yeah, I mean, I can do it. If not, it's in my diary.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
I'll send out emails because Mark Bebbington, he was leaving.
Oh, was he? I didn't realise that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think he'd got another job. I think still prevent related, but maybe regional. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
But then that's when it transpired. I can't remember her name now. That's bad. But I'll have it on emails.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I have got it, don't we? All right, it's 5 past now. I hope everybody's back. I just forgot to highlight this bit of film here. So when I played Carleen Furman clip of film in the first Trainers Network, I got a little bit of dissent, which was obviously very shocking because, you know, as I'm a girl fan, I was a little bit, you know, disappointed by that. But the film is from 2016, so, you know, we're 8 years on. And what she kind of says in that film is, if you've got a stairwell where there's lots of difficulties with children, if you move the children, you're still going to have the difficulties in the stairwell. And, you know, contextual safeguarding would say you need to think about that stairwell and what you do with it. And you know, a couple of people were saying, well, actually it was 3 people, 3 out of 5. So they were saying, well, if you change the stairwell, it's just going to move somewhere else. So this kind of, I'm not 100% buying into what she's saying totally. And they cited Craig Pinkney, who I actually have seen speak on the telly in the news. And what he was talking about on the telly in the news was stop and search. So he's saying, yeah, you can do stop and search and you will get some knives, but you won't solve the problem, because what you need to do is go back into those communities and look at why that crime is being committed in the first place. So he is more of a sort of violence reduction network type of person. He talks about knife crime. It is very good as well. But he's not really saying anything massively different from what Carleen Furman's saying. They're agreed. They're along the same lines. He's saying you need to go back and look at why they're doing it. She's saying we need to look at stuff other than just the family, and it might be broader, and it could be about where they're actually hanging out. If they're hanging out on the park, kids are drinking and smoking weed on the park, and they're part of that group, that's going to sort of escalate, and other things can happen potentially. So we need to look at that. So just to highlight that bit of the clip, that's also a TED talk. Right, but other learning from review. So we've got other learning that's quite high on our agenda at the moment, and you probably know about this. Fabricated and induced illness. We have a new procedure. We actually reviewed the procedure after a case review in the county, and then we've reviewed it again after another case, and also some national changes. So the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health published national guidance, which is called Perplexing Presentations, Fabricated or Induced Illness in Children, which I tried to read. Don't do that. I couldn't understand it. Other people who've got health backgrounds might do, and it did have actually a shorter version, a summary, that's what they call of it, which was helpful. or it picked out the main recommendation, but the procedure is a good procedure, and it takes the information from that document and puts it into procedure. Now, Child R has just been published by the county. That's an FII review, but the other review they had was one where the mother took the local authority to the, or I'm not sure who she took, but it was taken to the ombudsman, because what she said was, I didn't realise how ill I was, and I didn't realise I was hurting my child. I clearly needed help, and if I didn't get any of that help because it was all done so secretly, if I'd have got that help earlier, I wouldn't have hurt my child for so long and in such a way. And this has been said nationally as well by other people, saying, I didn't realise that what I was doing wasn't right. If I needed some support, you didn't give me any support because you did it all secretly. Because, of course, what we've always been told with FII is that if you suspect FII, don't tell the parents, go straight to a referral, and it's all done sort of secret squirrel. That's not what's going to happen now. So unless the child is in imminent immediate danger, as in any other safeguarding situation, you would talk to the parents in a regular way. You would include them, and in fact the whole procedure is now set up to include the parent. So there it is. Unless there's a risk of immediate serious harm to the child's health or life, the need for sharing information should be discussed with the child, young person and their parents. Now, I don't know if you were able to come to the Safeguarding Matters online. If you were, you'll know all about this, because Dr. Alan Elias Jones spoke for about half an hour on FII. That is in this clip here, which actually is the whole of that Matters online presentation, but I have got it just him talking now. And actually, because he's the lead paediatrician for safeguarding, or some similar title, and was part of creating that and procedure, he knows his stuff. Unfortunately, I've been asked to deliver some training on FII so that everybody can know about, be aware of the changes. I'll say as well, in this procedure there's also a flow chart. Again, I do think they're quite accessible, because you can just see, okay, I'm here, this is me, this is where I'm at. I do suspect that they're harming their child, but I'm not sure if they're doing it deliberately or not. So he talks about the difference between perplexing presentations and FII. So what do I do? And what we're going to have now are health and education RPs, rehabilitation plans. So we're going to have these meetings. So where we suspect something's amiss, so the symptoms don't match up with what is being said or what people are seeing, that we will invite the parents and other professionals to this education, health and rehabilitation plan meeting. If they refuse to come, that will raise the concerns as to why. If they come, then we'll work with the parents, to parent care or whatever, to try to resolve this situation. So that's kind of the difference in the way we're going to deal with FII. He also did say that true FII where parents are deliberately harming children is quite rare, but we get kind of a mixture of other stuff below that, where actually with a bit of support, parents will be able to, or carers will be able to manage the situations, the symptoms, the child, what they think they're doing is right quite often. So I've had a recent situation where a father was feeding his child his special diet, because he had his special diet because that was good for him. So he was feeding his child his special diet, but the child was failing to thrive because it didn't have all of the nourishment that the child needed. So if we work with that father, then hopefully we can remove the risk to the child and the harm to the child. But what I'm going to do in my presentation, you'll be pleased to know, is I'm just going to fit Dr. Alan Elias Jones all the way through, because I'm not a medical profession. I'm not someone from the medical profession. I think that shows when I start to talk in medical terms, I sort of say thingy, and so I'm going to just interpose him throughout so I can talk about the procedure, and he can talk about FII. So I'm hoping that will be quite successful. And in that particular, I'm going to send you the other clip link, and I might not be able to. In this clip link, he's at 47.55 minutes, 47.55 minutes. But I'll send you that in the email, so you don't need to remember that. But the rest of the session is very good as well, so you won't be it won't be too much of a hardship, I don't think. Emma, you have your hand up.
I do. Do you know roughly when that training will be, Liz? Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of this information and cascade it out to the social work teams and early help. So
I've got one on the 1st and one on the 8th at the moment, and then
is it advertised already? Because I can put those links.
It is, yeah. I'll send you the links in the email, Emma, so that you can
Brilliant.
put it in.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then I'm going to see if I need to tweak it a bit, and then do some more dates as well. Yeah. I think.
And also, sorry, I don't know if you saw it. I asked, the is it Baby's First Home session doing on the 14th?
Yes.
Safeguarding unit. We've got our service away day then, and there'd be so many people who'd be interested in knowing about that. Are you running another session?
Well, I think we possibly will. Yes, I think we'll record it anyway.
Yeah. Or it might. I was thinking, because Kate's doing a repeat. We're doing regular service away days, so I don't know if it would be something maybe you could come to us.
Yeah, maybe
later on, but
yeah.
But if there's another session, I think a lot of people from Safeguarding Unit want to go, particularly the conference chairs.
Oh, I didn't realise it was. Yeah, no, it'd be good for them to be there, really.
Sorry, this is getting really into the nuts and bolts of our diaries, but I'll talk to you about it at another point. But I was thinking it, because all the conference chairs will be there. Yeah, it will be a good one. But anyway.
I mean, I think if she'll do it again, we probably would repeat it again. We did this modern slavery one, we repeated twice, and it was quite a good way of doing it, I think.
I'll send you an email about that separately. Is that all right? Sorry, apologies.
Yeah. No, it's well, I mean, that's the point. We want learning to be shared, don't we? So the best way of doing it, we need to talk about. Yeah, we want to hit the most people. I think perhaps a lot of you might have come to the modern slavery neglect learning from reviews we did. I don't know if you did or didn't. We recorded this the second time, but unfortunately it didn't work properly, which was quite annoying. But child O, so this was a situation where there was organised crime. The police were watching the house. They were watching the house for 2 or 3 months. They then did a police swoop and arrested the dad and stepmum, and they found a child in there. They'd been watching the house. They didn't know that child was there. So that child hadn't been out the house while they were watching it. Father and stepmother were arrested at that point, so they were looking to see where she could go, who she could live with. Stepmother was released, and they were thinking about whether she could live with the stepmother, because the stepmother really wanted this child. But what they realised was that there was a lot of criminality in that house. It was an organised crime swoop. There's lots of concerns about the level of criminality. There'd been modern slaves living in that house and being exploited in that house. So they were concerned about the child in that house, which was why they actually removed her into care temporarily. When children come into care temporarily, or come into care at all, in fact, there is a medical that's done. So the baseline medical was done, looked after children medical, whatever they're called, and what they found from that medical was that this child had global developmental delay. which I didn't actually know what that meant. So people who come from a nursing background, and probably people who've been frontline social workers will know what that means, but she couldn't chew because she hadn't been weaned. She didn't walk standing up properly a lot of the time. She didn't respond to people talking. With the foster carer, she displayed some very strange behaviours, sort of getting out of her buggy and running across, walking across a park and hanging onto a man's leg, just clinging onto a very big man's leg who she didn't know. So very, very strange. She was really underweight, undernourished. And actually, we were quite surprised that we hadn't come across her before. So the circumstances of this were that she actually was born in an ambulance outside of a house in Leicester City. The mother was from a different country. She was spoken to in a different language by interpreters when she got to the hospital. She was asked why the baby hadn't been registered with a GP, and that was because she'd only just arrived in England and the baby was early. So she gave reasonable explanations as to why that happened. There was a referral made into social care. Social care followed up that referral. This is during COVID. They rang the house and they spoke to Dad. Dad could speak English. He said, yes, we've registered with a GP. We've got the cot. We've got everything. Everything's great. It's fine and dandy. So she went on to the Universal Health Service route. There were quite a lot of health appointments. There's the milestone appointments, checks. They attended all of those, sometimes online, sometimes in person. Dad, so we know dads don't get involved. Dad was very involved. He was quite often the person who was at the medical appointment, which was great because he could speak English. And Dad, there was a loving relationship witness between Dad and the baby that was mentioned, because I think we like it when dads are responsible and take that responsibility for babies. Anyway, so it turns out that's not really what was happening. She was living with the dogs. One of the slaves was helping to look after her. We think her sort of clinging to men is because when she was sort of taken out, that's when she did have positive interactions. So it was quite a difficult case, very, very complex. But when they went into the house, it was a lovely house. She was well dressed, but she'd got layers of clothes on to hide the fact that she was underweight. And so we need to think about how we work with modern slavery. And this is just a little bit, couple of slides from that, it was more than two, but from that session that we did. But where there's modern slavery, we're now saying you always need to think about neglect, and you always need to have that lens of modern slavery, because that disguised compliance is that if they're involved in organised crime, modern slavery is organised crime where they're lying every day to make their money. The presence of a child doesn't necessarily mean that that's a loving family situation. That child can also be seen as just a commodity, something that they can make money from, and we still don't know what the intentions were for this child. We also, once they started to look into it with the police and social care, they realised that the dad actually wasn't the dad. He was on the birth certificate, so very cleverly had put himself on the birth certificate, but he wasn't the natural father. The natural mum had gone back to her country of origin very soon after having the baby, so we believe that she was trafficked to have that baby. And stepmum is also somebody who's involved in organised crime. Both the stepmum and the dad, I'm going to call them that, it's easier, from big families involved in organised crime across Europe and reaching as far as Canada. And there's lots of children kind of interspersed along the way that they're not sure what happened to them. So when we're working with modern slavery, we need to think about what the experience of the child is, the lived experience. We We need to have professional curiosity. Obviously, we need to have that at all times. We need to think about neglect, and we need to understand that they're probably lying to us, and that's a horrible way to be working with people, but we need to understand that. And also we need to think about what we think about family units. So I think because we saw a dad, a very loving, nurturing dad to the outside, we thought that was a nice, we engaged with him. He was quite a charming man, I believe, when he was chatting away. So we need to think about what that unit really means and who the people are. So assumptions were made about the family and caregivers, because we did look to, like I say, to perhaps return the child to stepmom until we realised the situation. Layers of clothes, house was clean and tidy, really nice house, nice area, nice cars. And when the police deliver this, he talks about the lies, constantly lying to cover up everything. But we did really well. This is again another case of really good multi-agency working, and systems and tools can help. And so one of them is where they're not, where children aren't registered antenatally, we would now have a strategy discussion. Always. Now, we don't think in this particular situation that would have probably made any difference, because the strategy discussion, we think, because the mum would have played along and said, yes, here's the dad, and it would have gone that way. But we don't know that, obviously. So that would happen. We're talking about child protection medicals as a really good way of having this baseline knowledge about health. So what we did originally when we were first looking at the situation, when the arrests first happened, was we were asking health about what their records said, and of course their records were good and up to date, but the last record was about a year old. She was just coming up to her 2-year check. So we need to think about how that information, what that information says, because also we rely on parents a lot, don't we, when the children are little. And health professionals don't know when mum changed into stepmum. But I also, how would we know that if somebody appears with, it was a practice with lots of different doctors, they didn't see the same doctor twice? How would you know? If somebody comes in and says, I'm here with my baby, and the baby's on the system, and they're checking about the baby. So we need to think about this all the time, which I know it can be really difficult in some agencies. But what they're saying is, let's take names of people. So don't just put mum, let's put their name. But a child protection medical is a good, important baseline to understand child's development. So where we do have any concerns, we should probably opt for a child protection medical. We've got the neglect toolkit, which has been revised recently, actually to include adolescents. We've got 2 live PDF tools. One is about resistant behaviour, which includes disguised compliance. And the other one is about professional curiosity, which obviously encourages us to be professionally curious. And what we acknowledge in that is that quite often it's about confidence, and it's about good leadership. So it's sometimes about the manager saying, well, have you checked that out, or how do you know that, or what makes you think that, and getting workers to think more broadly, rather than just saying, okay, that's fine. Okay, Jackie, you did say you had to go, thank you. So, and in both of those live PDFs, they're across adults and children's they've been done, but there's case scenarios for you to work on. But they're meant to be tools, so they're meant to be for you to use with your teams or for yourself, and to think of scenarios and to think how you'd respond. So they're part of a new range that we're doing, where we're having building confidence in practice. So they're 2 sort of live PDFs to build confidence in practice. And we're currently working as well on a resource for managers around professional curiosity, which says just that if you're a manager, you have to try and build that professional curiosity in your team by giving your workers confidence and by asking them to go and explore. You don't have to do the work yourself. You can ask your worker in that case to do that work, where it's appropriate. And then communication. So we relied heavily on the man in this situation because he could speak English. in health in the hospital, they did a really good job. They did use interpreters to speak to the mother, and they did speak to her separately as well. But that wasn't consistently what happened. So when social care rang, they just spoke to Dad, but he did speak English. We did think he was Dad. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying why that happened, but why we shouldn't rely on that as being the truth, and we should use interpreters where possible. And in fact, the reason we thought that the child didn't speak originally was because we thought her first language wasn't English. So we got a worker to speak to her in her first language and read her a bedtime story, but she didn't recognise it. And in fact, what she responded to the most was dogs barking. So, you know, that's kind of, oh, I think that just is heartbreaking, actually. Anyway, she's doing really well now, just for information. So we need to make sure that we use interpreters consistently. And in fact, the police talked about using, you know, Google Translate if you need to, if you're out and about. So to kind of use what tools are available to you, but obviously if you've got a planned meeting or if you can get hold of an interpreter, to use that resource. Okay, the other thing we've got locally coming out of reviews is child sexual abuse. So we've got 3 reviews locally, 3 different care placements where sexual abuse has not been identified or recognised over a period of time. I think one's a foster placement, one's an independent foster placement, and one's a kinship care placement, I believe. And the learning that's coming from these, so these are all kind of in progress, is that professional curiosity wasn't there, didn't happen, because assumptions were made. So these were settled placements. So, and I think, you know, when you're busy and you're working and stuff, you think, okay, that one's okay, I'll go to this one that's causing me lots of problems. The assessment of carers in one of them was perhaps not robust enough, and that links to the support and matching. The voice of the child wasn't heard. And again, we've got situations where that child was spoken to in front of the carer. So they've been brought into care because of situations that are happening elsewhere, but we've assumed that then that care placement is a safe place, which I can understand why that was assumed, but we still need to have those conversations separately with children and young people. Relationships weren't built with those children. So even actually, even if they had spoken to them separately, we're not sure they would have disclosed because, or said anything, because relationships weren't really built, because they were seen as being in a safe placement and sort of left to kind of flourish in that environment. What one of the reports is suggesting and saying is that social workers, and it does talk about social workers, aren't thinking the unthinkable. So then they're almost not seeing it because they don't believe it would be there, because these are foster carers, these are people that we trust, or kinship carers, and so we don't believe it to be there. So they're not thinking the unthinkable. And also criticised the sexual abuse procedure, saying that it was very broad. Now, it is a very broad procedure because it's for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. And so what local authorities are saying is that actually they, within their own local authority procedures, they probably need something a bit more robust. And they're saying to use the risk tools that the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse has. And there's the link to those there. We have changed our sexual abuse procedure slightly. But it is still very broad, so it's more about local authorities and their response to that. But what I've learned as well recently is that where there's sexual abuse, a referral should be made to the SARC, so the Sexual Assault Resource Centre. I'm making that up, I don't know what it stands for. But basically they do the medicals, but they also support children who've been sexually abused, and adults as well. But this is the specific children's part of it. There's one in, it's run by Nottingham hospitals for the East Midlands, and there's one in Northamptonshire that is quite often accessed by children in Leicestershire. The person who runs that centre has come to the partnership and said, in the first quarter of this year, we had 8 referrals. Equivalent referrals in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire were between 40 and 50. So we think there's an underreporting. We know there's an underreporting anyway, so we think that people aren't possibly following the procedure that says that you should inform the SARC. The SARC should then be invited to the strategy meeting. They've been invited from December to April. They were invited to 6 from Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So this is across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. So something's gone wrong. This is a systemic failing. Something's gone wrong. So we're aware of this. I mean, what this woman was offering, Hannah, is that she's got a training package. She wants to do something about it. She's got putting together a training package, which will roll out multi-agency, but probably will be rolled out within agencies such as the local authority anyway, and health potentially, and schools potentially as well, because what she's also saying is they've got a helpline. It's a 24-hour helpline where you can speak to a doctor, because the doctors are employed 24/7. And if you're not speaking to the doctor, you're speaking to someone who works all the time, a nurse, a specialist nurse who works all the time in that environment. So you're getting good specialist advice. And they offer lots of different services, as well as the medical. So they will keep samples if children don't want to make a complaint. For if they want, so this is young people perhaps who might self-refer because they take self-referrals and don't want to make a complaint, so that they can make it later if so they've got DNA samples. They do that for adults, they do that for children too. Perhaps they do that as well if there's not enough evidence. I think if there's samples there would be, but you know, they offer lots of services. So coming is a training package from the SARCs saying what they do, how you access them, and this should be rolled out hopefully quite soon. And since it's been raised in the partnerships, I keep getting people saying, okay Liz, can you tell me the dates of this? And I don't know it yet, so as soon as I know it, I'll let people know so that can be shared out as well. So that's coming. But we have got an issue. I mean, sexual abuse is underreported anyway, so we know a lot of people don't disclose sexual abuse until they're adults anyway. We know that, but where we're missing it, we perhaps need to get a little bit tighter and try and work that better. And then, so now we're coming on to national reviews. Excuse me. So you've probably seen both of these. So the national review into the murders of Arthur Lavinia Hughes and Star Hobson, and the independent review of children's social care by Josh McAllister. So I'll go through Arthur and Star. So again, this is a child safeguarding practice review type of format. So they're not looking at who did what wrong. They're looking at why it went wrong. What's the learning? And what the conclusions were with Arthur were that professionals had a limited understanding of what life was like for Arthur. There was no trusted relationship with professionals. They didn't hear Arthur's voice. So all of that is not building that relationship. It's not talking to the child on their own. It's not thinking about what their circumstances are like. It's not working in a trauma-informed way. And I think this is really interesting. Father was seen as protective. This wasn't reviewed even when concerns were raised. Now, father's ex-partner is in prison. So Arthur's mum is in prison for killing her partner, her partner at the time. So I think there's a kind of like a distorted kind of picture of Arthur's actual family, maternal side of the family, because she's in prison. So she's killed someone. So she's been abusive in relationships, and potentially he'd received some abuse in relationship. So then they assessed him. He was seen as protective. But they didn't think about his change of circumstances and didn't think about whether he'd been in an abusive relationship before and what that might mean. They didn't listen to the concerns of Arthur's wider family, and I do wonder if that is because of the mother being in prison. I mean, that's not stated in the report. I'm just making my own assumptions from this. And then the response to bruising. So there were photographs taken of the bruising on Arthur by a member of his family that were sent into, I think, the police first, or social care first, and then to the other. So they were sent to both police and social care. No discussion, no strategy meeting. So any procedure about bruising and for child that significant would have had a strategy meeting. That should have happened, and it didn't happen. Our conclusion is that pivotal dynamic underpinning many of these practice issues was a systemic flaw in the quality of multi-agency working. There was an over-reliance on single agency processes with superficial joint working and joint decision making. And I think that's something that will come through into our learning, that when we're working as a multi-agency, it has to be working in a real way. It's not just about ticking boxes. So even if we're talking to fathers, it's not just about ticking, oh yeah, spoke to dad. It's not about that. It's about, what does that actually mean? What does that mean for the child? Because we're working with a child. What does it mean in their day-to-day life? What does it mean for them? They didn't worry about the fact that Arthur and dad moved to the girlfriend's house because of lockdown, COVID. So they moved because of that. They didn't think about the impact that would have on him, and if it would make any difference to his living arrangements. They didn't consider that dad's ability to be protective might have changed. So none of this was considered, and it was all during lockdown. And actually, when I read the report, I do think it's quite a well-written report. It doesn't really, it doesn't apportion blame. You don't feel blame. I just felt they were very new social workers and new police officers, and I'm not saying that's an excuse for what happened, but you know, they're saying it's systemic. So the leadership and the strategic people weren't sort of talking to each other in a multi-agency way as they should have done, and that was kind of allowed to happen. So really tragic. And you see this mirrored as well in Star. So limited understanding of what life was like for her, constant moves, and we know people move a lot when they're trying to avoid statutory services. Decision making at the front door was flawed. So a more thorough assessment was warranted. So they went for early help assessment, who said, yeah, it's all okay. They didn't think there was anything more there. They didn't look at the family dynamics or the relationship, and they dismissed how Star was being treated. They didn't listen to concerns of Star's wider family, and they'd actually lived with great grandmother Star and her mum, but then they'd gone back to living with the mum's partner, and this was a single-sex relationship, and we think that perhaps it's rumoured that the family were being homophobic about the single-sex relationship, so maybe that's why they weren't listened to. So again, that's not mentioned in the report, but I think I've heard it in different interviews that I've seen. But the partner was a perpetrator of domestic abuse and was a known perpetrator of domestic abuse. That wasn't considered. The impact on mum wasn't considered. It wasn't considered that mum might need to speak to them separately or on her own, and they didn't see Star, and they didn't think about the impact on Star. And they're very damning about Bradford, actually, and assessment's not fit for purpose, no triangulation of information, lack of formal multi-agency processes, children's social care in turmoil. This was 2020, which impeded quality decision making. So definitely part of the situation at the time impacted. And I think I remember when Leicester City got their needs improvement from Ofsted, they talked about the situation in children's social care at the time, that, you know, a set of circumstances had come together to make the system not function appropriately. And then decision by the Secretary of State for Education on the 25th of January 2022 to place children's social care in in Bradford into a not-for-profit trust following a report from the Children's Services Commissioner highlighting the scale and depth of systemic problems in children's services in Bradford, which in our view had a substantive and material impact on the quality of practice and decision making about STAR. So this systemic issue across the whole of the process, if you like. So superficial assessments, and again, this was during COVID as well, and I'm not making excuses, but I don't think there was much advice given to some frontline services, particularly children's social workers, about how they should work. There was no PPE. They were being told not to go into places where people had COVID, and that was used as an excuse to not let them in on one occasion as well. So, you know, we do need to think about that as well. I'm not trying to make excuses for what happened. I'm just saying we have to look at it in the round. And the reason that this independent review of children's social care is really important is because this sits alongside that Arthur and STAR review, and both of them kind of say that the services were in chaos and that multi-agency working was really poor, and there was a lot of sort of lip service to those processes. And then at the same time, Josh McAllister is reviewing social care. Now, when I first saw him, I was quite rude about him. I thought he looked a little bit like what I'd expect him to look like, and I didn't have much faith in his review, which was very rude of me and also judgmental, and also shows a bias in my thinking, because actually, if you read the report, it is really good. Now, I wonder if it's just because it's saying a lot of things that I think it's really good, and I have to check myself about that unconscious bias, all that stuff. So anyway, but what he said is that they're looking at the 1989 Children Act and seeing if it's fit for purpose. And he interviewed a lot of people. So he took information from a lot of people, a lot of children as well, a lot of children who were in care, who were using services, a lot of people who were as children, were adults now, but as children used those services, families. He looked at workers, he spoke to workers. So he did a lot of research for his independent review. And you can go to the website, and these are really good. These explainer videos talk about his report. They're quite short, sharp, sort of 5-minute-y, 6-minute-y bits of explanation, and talks about different parts of the report and how things were done, etc. It's really quite good, I have to say. And part of what he's saying is, and what's in his recommendations, is that we need a balance between helping families and keeping children safe. So he talks about a family help system to improve the underlying reasons as to why people come into care and form relationships that help professionals more accurately identify serious concerns. So he's not only talking about forming relationships with children and families, he's talking about forming relationships with workers, with our multi-agency partners. Help from social workers and others in many different agencies. So he's saying social workers are the sort of important workers in terms of child protection and child safeguarding, but everybody else has a part in it as well. And he talks about this barrier between early help and children's social care creating problems, not solving them, and that it's a created barrier that makes things worse for children, not better. He said it needs 2 million investment over 4 years, 2 billion, sorry, got my consonant wrong there. And that we need a system that can distinguish between families who are waiting for a lifeline of help and families who are dangerous. And I quite like that. That's that helping families, keeping children safe. I quite like that sort of way of thinking about it. He talks about introducing co-workers for all child protection plans, and that only the most experienced social workers will make child protection decisions. So what he's talking about is a multi-agency child protection service, perhaps a little bit like a MASH, a multi-agency safeguarding hub, where people sit together and work together in that child protection situation. And that links into the new family help system. but he does see that child protection bit as quite a sort of separate specialist bit. He thinks that we need to improve information sharing and strengthen multi-agency partnerships, and that by sitting together and working together in this way, that would help as well, because he says safeguarding is everyone's business. The bad news is that the recommendations he's made, which are very, I think, are good recommendations, won't necessarily be taken on by government. What he said, he's delivered some sort of workshops on his report and said what he wants us to do is lobby our MPs to try to take up the recommendations if we think that they should, I suppose. But what I do know is that there's a board being put together, a group, board, subgroup in government to look at those recommendations. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of other stuff going on. So, but I think perhaps when we go back into, when they start to sit again, perhaps that will become a little bit more obvious what's happening. So that's the situation now. I mean, this would be a massive change. What he also says, interestingly, is that Section 17 isn't being used how it was meant to be used in the 1989 Act. He said that Section 17, which is the Children in Need part of the Children Act 1989, is the threshold's too high. That was meant to be the early help part of that act. It was meant to be used for more children, more families at an earlier stage. But because, I suppose, of resources, money particularly, and the need to have thresholds, that's sort of changed. He also said that 2 billion would be needed for the four years to start the process, but then that the process would continue to be funded, because he sees a sort of children in care system as well, where people would not be allowed to profit from children in care, which of course I think is great, because he says a lot of money is going into placements that is for profit. It's not for sustaining those placements, it's for people to, you know, become rich from, and he says that's not how a children's social care system should be run. So the money saved from that system would help to support this system, because also less children would come into care as well. That's what his vision is, which I think is a lovely vision. I don't know how it will, if it will ever work, but I'm feeling optimistic today. Some days I don't, today I do. So that's all coming, I think. Again, it won't be a quick, I don't know, you never know, do you, with politics? Depends who wants to make an impact and in what way. So we'll just watch that space, and I'll keep you updated on what happens. Other things we've got coming are liberty protection safeguards. And I know people who work with children with disability know a lot more about this than I do. But the liberty protection safeguards will replace DOLS, I believe, which is deprivation of liberty safeguards. And the LPS is applicable from 16 plus. And to kind of use LPS, you need to understand the Mental Capacity Act, because it's based on the ability to make the decision as to whether somebody has capacity. And I have commissioned training on the Mental Capacity Act, which was really good training. And when I came out of that session, I thought, oh yes, I totally understand what's happening. Unfortunately, time has passed since then, and I'm struggling with understanding what the LPS will actually mean to us as workers with those 16 plus year olds. So it's really where they lack capacity that they will come into play, not at any other point. So if we deprive somebody of their liberty, because I'm using old terminology, there has to be a reason for that, and that comes with whether they have capacity or not. But what did come out of that training I did on the Mental Capacity Act was that actually we always defer to parental responsibility for 16 plus, whereas really we should use the Mental Capacity Act, because at that point in time, if they have capacity, they're capable of making, children and young people are capable of making decisions for themselves, and so we shouldn't necessarily defer to the parent, we should listen to them. but I know that people in schools would say we would always talk to the parents and until they leave the school type of thing, unless they've turned 18. Sharon, you had your hand up. You've got your hand up, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Liz, actually, we do kind of start with, through the transition and through the safeguarding process, we do actually start to introduce the fact with Gillick competence around a kind of age 13, as soon as they come onto our transition caseload. And actually we do assess capacity, and if somebody at 16 has got capacity to make a decision about whether they come into the hospice or not, we won't admit them if they say they don't want to be there. So even if parents are bringing them, because actually legally they are old enough to make that decision. Where it is slightly different is if young people between 16 and 18 haven't got capacity, then parental responsibility still stands. But actually at the moment, once they get to 18, that's where the deprivation of liberties comes in, and that's going to be the change with the LPS. That's going to be a real, and we kind of anticipate that there is going to be a lot of family anxiety around that, because at the moment the deprivation of liberties just applies to the setting, whereas when it's going to be liberty protection safeguard, it's going to be at home. Yeah, so for us organisationally it'll be easier, but actually we think that families are going to be quite anxious about that process applying at home. So we're kind of anticipating putting together some information for families around that. But yeah, at the moment, and it does sound better than deprivation of liberties, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Obviously, when that came in too, families were fairly anxious about that. But yeah, at the moment, it's around assessing capacity for whether that young person understands why they're coming into us, whether they can make that decision or not. And if they can't, then we would look at putting in a request for authorisation, even though parents are saying it's okay because they can no longer consent at 18. So yeah. I'm kind of hoping it's going to bring things in line, because the Mental Capacity Act does start at 16, you know, so there is that disparity. And actually the between 16 and 18, there's a bit of a grey area, which hopefully it will help to address a little bit, I think.
Oh, that's really helpful, thank you. So I think people who use it or know it and understand this area are able to explain it really well, so that's really helpful, thank you. I do think it will cause anxiety, like you say, across the piece, and I've actually been to some learning on it and it was a really good session. I know it was a really good session because everybody told me it was, but I still came away not really understanding it. And I think it was because it was sort of saying this is the difference between liberty protection safeguards and doles, but I don't really know what doles is, so I think that was why it was probably too high a level. So I'm going to be looking for somebody to deliver, because LPS I think now isn't going to be introduced till perhaps next year now. You might know that better.
I think they're saying April 23 at the moment, but it's been put back since October 2019, so it's not a definite, I don't think, but I think that's what they're aiming for.
So once we know when it is more definite, we'll get some training from somebody who knows what they're talking about, which will be better than training from me, I can assure you, in no uncertain terms. And we'll try and give people the information that they need, and also share information, because, like, you know, there are people on this call I know who know and understand A, doles, B, Mental Capacity Act, and C, what's coming. So, you know, if we can share that, that'd be really helpful. But it will have quite a big impact, I think, perhaps on health as well, health, homes, children with disabilities, lots of different situations, care environments, although there's quite strict rules around that anyway that probably link into that anyway already. So, and I think the use of Gillick competence as well is quite interesting, because that's what when I saw about the Mental Capacity Act, she said, yeah, that Gillick competence is a sort of natural forerunner of the Mental Capacity Act, and actually really supersedes parental responsibility when children have capacity, which is what you're saying, really. So that's really helpful, thank you. Okay, the other thing that's kind of big on the agenda, and we've already talked about, is being trauma informed. It's kind of quite buzz, I think. It's quite a buzz sort of way of thinking about things. And for me, with a social work type of background, this is what I think social workers should be doing anyway. But I understand that actually in different areas of work and with different pressures as well, it's not always, A, people might not have understood what this means, and B, it might not be that easy to do this sort of trauma informed behaviour. So there's lots of support around that, and you know, instead of thinking about the problem behaviour or the problem child, looking at why. So it's about looking at why things happen, working alongside, talking to people in a way that's accessible to them and that's not prejudicial in any way or discriminatory. So those sorts of ways of speaking and being sensitive to people's unique lived experiences fosters trust and creates an environment conducive to effective support. And it is that, isn't it? It's about building those relationships when we're working with children, young people and their families. Okay, now this is the last bit. We have reviewed the Safeguarding Children Competency Framework. And it's going to be launched in September, and I was going to launch it on the 26th of September, but that's now Icon Week. Well, it probably always was Icon Week, so I don't want to do it in that week. So I'm going to try and do it the week, I don't know when, 100% now. But what I want to do is launch it probably with an online sort of, this is it, ta-da, and then do some sessions like you used to do, Emma, where we work with people on how to use it. It isn't vastly different, but we now only have 5 core competencies, and that's for anybody who comes across children. So it could be a receptionist. We always talk about receptionists, but they see quite a lot, don't they? Somebody who works in school food, you know, in a dinner lady or a dinner man. So people who come across it but wouldn't need to have such a acceptance of all the competencies. So if you work or volunteer with children, you would need 10, still need 10 competencies. But if you're just so you might work across children and adults in a role that's not safeguarding at all, but you might come across it, you'd only need the first 5, and that just talks about recognising and how to report, really. And then there's additional competencies that are selected. We've not put them into groups this time because apparently that confuses people, but I think probably in a couple of years they'll say, oh, it'd be better if they're in groups because I don't know which ones I should select. So but anyway, there's some of the things we'll talk about in the workshops, and that is coming. And mostly we find that people outside of the statutory agencies use the assessment, use the competency framework. A lot of people in nurseries and childminder and early years types of settings, a lot of early help settings use the competency framework. And it's a good way, if you're not sure the standard to which your staff should be trained or understand safeguarding, it's a good framework to use if you don't already have a framework in place. Okay,